In reading the stories of our patriarchs and matriarchs, we're supposed to remember an important maxim in Jewish midrashic interpretation, an important principle. Ma'aseh avot siman labanim. You've heard me say that before. The actions of the fathers, ma'aseh avot, are a sign for the children, siman labanim. This idea actually comes from the 13th century, the Spanish interpreter Nachmanides. And when he said this, he meant to change the way we read and understand the Torah. According to him, these are not just stories about the lives of our mothers and fathers, but they're supposed to teach us about our lives. These are stories that are supposed to give some sort of moral message to future generations. And so we have to read and understand them with particular intent, always thinking about their implications for us, not just for them. And one of the things we notice about Avraham, a feature so common in his story that we can't help but notice, I mentioned it when I introduced the Parsha, is that he is a man on the move. The stories about him often involve his getting up and journeying from one place to another place. He is the wandering Jew. Some of his travels are made on his own initiative, but others are products of divine command. Of those commanded journeys, twice in the Torah is Abraham commanded with the unusual words, Lech Lecha. Not just go, but go forth, I think you'll find translated in your Chumash, but actually, according to tradition, it means something deeper. Lech Lecha doesn't mean go somewhere. It means go somewhere and you will find something about yourself on that journey. Go somewhere and discover your mission. Go somewhere and there discover your purpose. God commands Avraham, Lech Lecha, twice. Once in our Parsha, read it this morning, Lech Lecha me'artzecha u'mimoladetecha, leave your land and go forth to the land that I will show you. And where is the other place that God commands Abraham, Lech Lecha? Well, we read that story on Yom Kippur. And we're going to, on Rosh Hashanah. And we're going to read it again next week. It's the story of the binding of Isaac. Parshat Vayera. God tells Abraham, Lech Lecha el Eretz HaMoriah. Go forth to the land of Moriah. What is the significance of these two Lech Lechas? Why the emphasis on these two particular journeys when Abraham went on so many? In the Midrash, we actually find one sage trying to draw a connection between the two. Amar Rabbi Levi, Shtei Pe'amim Ktiv Lech Lecha. Rabbi Levi said, twice in the Torah it says Lech Lecha. Ve'ein anu yodim eizo chaviva. And we don't know which time it was more important. Im hashniya, was it the second time? Im harishona, or was it the first time? It's a strange question that he's asking. He sees the connection like we do, the two Lech Lechas, and is trying to ask, well, since these words obviously define a commandment of great importance, which one is more important than the other? So I want to submit an idea this morning that I think might help us understand Rabbi Levi's question and maybe shine some light on why these journeys receive special emphasis in Abraham's story. Let's start with the first Lech Lecha from this morning's Parsha. The purpose and destination of this first journey is very clear. It is a Lech Lecha focused on a land. Go to the land that I will show you, God says. This first Lech Lecha is about the land of Israel. In order to fully realize his potential, God says to Abraham, you need to get out. You need to leave your household and go to a land where you will be a blessing, and that one day your descendants will inherit. The first Lech Lecha introduces the idea that we are not just a religion, but a people tied to a land, where we are meant to carry out the precepts of that religion. We take this for granted nowadays, but imagine if we really were starting to read the Torah from the beginning, with no previous knowledge. Well, that's what this Lech Lecha is. It's an introduction to us of the whole concept of having a Jewish national homeland. Artsecha, your land. This Lech Lecha is about Zionism. It is about the love of the land of Israel, the Jewish relationship with the land of Israel. And the second Lech Lecha el Eretz HaMoriah. What is that Lech Lecha about? Well, what does Moriah mean? One rabbi in the Midrash says Moriah comes from Hora'ah, which means to teach or decide matters of Jewish law. Another rabbi says it comes from the word Morah, which means fear of God. Another says Moriah comes from Ora, which means light, and light is a euphemism for Torah. Actually, no matter which of those interpretations you choose, all of these definitions of Moriah relate to God or to Torah. Moriah, at least in the rabbinic imagination, is not a physical destination. It is a theological idea. It's Abraham's journey to become a Jew, to have a relationship with God, to understand that God has a purpose, that we are meant to carry out that purpose. It is about Judaism qua religion, Torah, God, what you might even call today Jewish education. That's the second Lech Lecha. And I think if we understand these two Lech Lechas in those lights, then Rabbi Levi's question starts to make sense. Ezo chaviva, which one is more important? Rabbi Levi is asking, what part of Judaism is more important? Is Judaism as a religion more important? Or is Judaism as a national, territorial identity more important? It's not a crazy question. Even today, it is possible for reasonable people to argue both sides. There are those who might say that today all Jews are Jews by choice. In other words, our Judaism must first be motivated by personal religious aspirations, and that comes first. And there are others who say that those who are not loyal to Jewish peoplehood and to the state of Israel, well, they forfeit their rights to be called Jews, no matter how personally devout they might think they are. You don't consider yourself part of a people. You don't support the land of that people. I don't care how many times you put on tefillin. Is the Lech Lecha of Zionism, peoplehood, more important? Or is the Lech Lecha of Torah and mitzvot more important? Rabbi Levi's question actually also brings to mind a dangerous theory that is being peddled around nowadays. There is a small but growing number of Jews who say that being Jewish has nothing to do with Israel. Because of this belief, they don't recognize any connection between anti-Zionism, the belief that Jews do not have collective rights to sovereignty in their ancestral homeland, that there's no connection between that and anti-Semitism, the global rise of hatred towards Jews. For such people, Zionism and Judaism live in two separate neighborhoods. One has nothing to do with the other. In North America, we find such views expressed by Jewish activist organizations like Open Hillel, If Not Now, Independent Jewish Voices. These Jewish organizations seek to replace Zionism's emphasis on religious particularism with a Judaism that is rooted in an ethical vision that is meant to transcend culture and peoplehood. They understand the second Lech Lecha to be more important than the first. And in Israel, we actually find some who say the first Lech Lecha is more important. A few years ago, the great Israeli novelist Aleph Bet Yehoshua provoked great controversy when he said the following at the annual conference of the American Jewish community, and I quote, "My identity is Israeli. The Jewish religion does not play a role in my life. It is the territory and the language that built my identity." Yehoshua has always been a bit of an iconoclast, so maybe it's not surprising to hear his words. But actually, I've met many Israelis who express similar views. I'm Israeli. I'm not Jewish. The separation of the two Lech Lechas is certainly a departure from historical precedent. Think of the different waves of Aliyah over the past 2 centuries. Consider the ultra-Orthodox disciples of the Vilna Gaon who came to Israel at the middle of the 19th century. Consider the Zionist socialists who came a bit later. Consider those who made Aliyah from the former Soviet Union in the 80s and 90s. These groups had very different views on Jewish tradition. Radically different views, I would say. But they all saw themselves as partners in the realization of the same ancient dream: to return to the Jewish national homeland, to return to their land, to the land of Israel. They also believed that they had a right to be there, a moral right, a legal right, a historical right. Others questioned that right, and they still question it today. They paint these Olim and those who live in Israel today even as remnants of old colonialism. But Jews were generally united in the conviction that came from the story we read this morning, the conviction that the land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people, not to Israelis, to the Jewish people, as stated in the Balfour Declaration. That's because we all believe in the chain that links us back to 3,000 years of Jewish history. A chain weaved together, I think, by 2 Lech Lechas, more than anything else. The Lech Lecha of land, the Lech Lecha of lore. For this reason, we should be applauding Premier Ford and the Ontario government for becoming this week the first province in Canada to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism. The IHRA definition explicitly recognizes that anti-Zionism, that is the delegitimization and demonization of the Jewish state, is a clear and unequivocal expression of anti-Semitism. Criticism of Israeli policy is not anti-Semitic, but calling into question the right of the Jewish people to self-determination most certainly is. Israel and the Jewish people do not live in separate neighborhoods. We live in the same city, on the same street, in the same house, and to attack one is to attack the other. Rabbi Levi said, "We don't know which Lech Lecha is more important because the fact is both are equally important. Without Torah and tradition, Zionism has no legitimacy. And without Zionism, we present a Torah and a tradition that are simply inauthentic. A Torah which ignores the first commandment given to a Jew may as well not bother with the rest of them. As we have learned, Ma'aseh Avot Siman Labanim. The story of the patriarchs is instruction for the descendants. The falsehood of choosing one Lech Lecha over the other, or saying even that one is more important than the other, that wasn't just a message for Abraham or a question for Rabbi Levi to ponder. It is a statement, it is an idea, it is a heritage for we, their children. And if we follow in those paths ourselves, weaved together by these two commitments, then perhaps someday even our great-grandchildren will look at our ma'asim, at our ways, and be motivated themselves to continue forward on this millennia-long journey until the time of our ultimate redemption. May this be God's will.